Greetings from Alexandria, Virginia. My name is Daniel Blier. Over the past 5 years, I've had the unbelievable privilege and the good fortune to share the screen with authors and outstanding historians producing 20th century history right here at Martha Washington Library. And my good luck hasn't run out yet, because in that respect, today's event is no different than either. To our panelists and our very special guests, Ann Todd, author of OSS Operation Black Mail, and Brian Crim, author of Our Germans. Thank you both so much for joining us. In a few moments, my co-host Melissa will introduce Ann Todd, who will speak for approximately 20 minutes. Next, I will introduce Brian Crim, who likewise will speak for approximately 20 minutes. The remainder of our time together will be spent collecting questions from you, the audience, to ask either of our two panelists. If you have a question you'd like to hear our panelists answer, please type it at any time into the Zoom chat feature.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melissa Weih. I'm a park ranger at Prince William Forest Park. I'm here to introduce Ann Todd, author of OSS Operation Black Mail, One Woman's Covert War Against the Imperial Japanese Army. Ann worked for 6 years as a historian for the National Museum of the Marine Corps and served in the United States Coast Guard. She has also served as a consultant for the National Geographic Society. Research for her book was done while working as a cabin camp host at Cabin Camp 4 in Prince William Forest Park, where the OSS trained in the 1940s. A dog lover, Ann currently lives in Texas with her 4 dogs, Angel, Nyla, Summer, and Loki. Here's Ann Todd.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Melissa. I'll just get going here. Daniel, pull up my slides. Oh, let's back it up to the first one. So we had trouble sharing screens, so Daniel's going to have to click through my PowerPoint for me as soon as he gets that teed up. There we go. All righty. OSS. My area of interest for many years now has been the Office of Strategic Services, often referred to as the wartime precursor to the CIA. And it was, but it also gave birth to Special Forces, the National Security Agency, and all forms of psychological warfare being practiced by this country today. It was also a quirky fly-by-night outfit that made things up as it went along, had quite the reputation. Its detractors referred to it as oh-so-social, spies with ties. My personal favorite was a PhD who could win a bar fight. And there were characters drawn to OSS. I have a little short list here. In addition to every nationality and ethnic group, we had movie stars, film producers, artists, journalists, priests, missionaries, lots of missionaries, believe it or not, dog trainers, safecrackers, members of the Canine Corps, bird watchers, anthropologists, archaeologists, carrier pigeons, and one elephant was on the rolls of OSS at the end of the war. Okay, next, Daniel. OSS was the creation of William J. Donovan, Medal of Honor winner from the First World War, Wall Street lawyer. So Donovan convinced Franklin Delano Roosevelt that this country needed a centralized intelligence organization, one that would not only gather intelligence, but also conduct commando-style warfare, irregular warfare, guerrilla warfare, something the regular military just did not like the idea of. Next. So in 2010, I was casting about for a dissertation topic when I met an amazing woman, Betty McIntosh, who had served in OSS during the war and then went on to a long career in the CIA. Here she is during the war with her dog, Sammy. She was also a dog lover, had that in common. We became fast friends for the 5 years that I researched and talked with her on almost a daily basis. But basically, I was commuting from College Station, Texas, go Aggies, and that just wasn't tenable. So I threw my 3 not small dogs in an RV and sold everything, headed north, and ended up in Prince William Forest Park, 30 miles south of DC, where I could interview her, spend time with her, and work in the National Archives. Next. Make part of a long story short, that dissertation was turned into a book and published by Naval Institute Press in 2017. We'll circle back to Betty in a minute. Next. So I want to tell you about the role it played in the war and what it was like to be there as a scholar and a volunteer for the Park Service. Next. The wartime name for Prince William was Chapawamzik. That was the Algonquin name. It butts up at the bottom of it's not on this screen, but in the south, Quantico Marine Corps Base. Quantico is also an Algonquin name. And in the top right corner is where my camp, Camp 4, Cabin Camp 4 was. It was created at the request of Eleanor Roosevelt, who she wanted a, summer retreat for inner city children in DC. So it has a whole separate entrance from the rest of the park. It's very remote and beautiful. Next. Prince William is a jewel of a park, if you've never been there, with gorgeous hiking trails, a scenic loop, and it's just right there south of DC. Next. This is my road to my camp. We called it the Burma Road in the springtime. Next. And this is the road in the winter. And I got to tell you, the fall, I couldn't find a photograph, but the fall is spectacular. Next. So there's 5 cabin camps that were constructed by the Civilian Conservation Corps between 1935 and 1942. Again, I was in Camp 4. Each camp had 4 cabins with a bathhouse, a craft lodge, and a mess hall. And this was the bathhouse in my camp. The Park Service has gone to great lengths to preserve the architectural integrity of these cabins. I was told, maybe Melissa can verify this, that at one point after a storm damage happened, Italian craftsmen were brought in to teach the rangers how to hand hew the boards that went up on those cabins. I don't know if that's a myth or not. Next. Campers are not allowed to put thumbtacks or nails in the walls, so they get really creative, hanging things from rafters. Next. The cabins are rustic but comfortable. Next. And next. This was my mess hall. And we had quite a few weddings while I was there. And this is, the tables are set here for a rehearsal dinner. Next. This was our home while I lived in Camp 4. Got to tell y'all, it was a sweet gig, very remote and quiet, deep in the woods. And my dogs and I were just happy as clams. Next. This is one of my favorite rangers. Next. My camp, we had all kind of campers, but my camp was really popular with the LARPers, live action role players. This one is kind of a Renaissance festival theme. I'll tell you, these people, a lot of them I found out have stratospheric security clearances. So they would come down from DC and all over actually. And this was how they would decompress. And they really got themselves buried in the part of whatever they were playing. So while I was there, we had lots of jousting and sword fights with foam swords. We had a Viking funeral out on the ball field. There's a lot of chainmail constructed from aluminum flip tops. Very elaborate stuff. Next. This was a craft lodge in my camp. And next. And this was my craft lodge during the war. So here I'm going to pivot and take us back to the 1940s when this craft lodge was a training facility for the communications branch of OSS. And the camp was called Area C. Next. So here you see in the craft lodge, we had Morse code training classes, sending and receiving. Next. Classroom discussions. This one's a demonstration of an aerial antenna. Next. I got to know an OSS veteran from Area C, Art Reinhardt, who used to come to the park and give talks. Every Tuesday, it was called Tuesdays with Art. And I became very close friends with Art. Next. And this is Art when he was 18 years old. He trained for operations in the China-Burma India theater of operations. He was dropped in the middle of nowhere in China with a James Bond type radio called the SSTR-1. It was quite advanced for the time and became sort of the, the go-to for field radios. He sent targeting information for airstrikes. He roamed the countryside to find suitable landing strips, and he would radio that stuff in. Next. Art gave me some great descriptions of what his training was like in Area C. So, for example, when he went to the mess hall, there were no chow lines, but they were served gourmet meals cooked by a chef Donovan had brought from Boston. He woke each morning not to reveille, but to songs like, "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning." There were no duty, guard duty or any kind of duty except for doing your own laundry. The Marine Corps stocked the camp with rations for the day hikes that they did do. And at night, before they retired around 11, they got a late night snack. So Donovan knew that many of these men, if not all, had been seconded from the Army. He felt like they'd had enough regimentation. He wanted them to focus on the skills they would need for the mission. So none of that military nonsense. You can imagine why the generals just really didn't like Donovan. Next. Every camp did have a firing range, and there was weapons training. If you go to Camp 4 now, there you can see the berm down by the lake where they used to fire their weapons. Next. For exercise, they played volleyball and they did do their hikes. They had some very competitive baseball games. Next. This brings me back to Betty. This was her first day at OSS when she was being issued her credentials. This is her OSS ID. This was in November 1943. And she was destined to go to China, Burma, India, theater of operations, just like Art. Next. Before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, she was a reporter in Honolulu, Hawaii. And in fact, that's what she was doing the day the Japanese bombed the island. She was cooking breakfast in her house overlooking, I think it was Waimea Bay, and actually saw the planes go by. So she rushed down and interviewed nurses in the hospital and did all kinds of things and wrote up a fabulous piece about how women reacted that day. The Army had slapped a lid of censorship over the entire archipelago and wouldn't let that out, nor anything else she tried to write. But the Washington Post published that piece 70 years later. So Betty was recruited into the new branch of morale operations, and she would learn to confuse, deceive, and demoralize the enemy. And in this case, next, the enemy were the Japanese that had occupied Burma and most of China at this time, Malaysia. So when she did end up going abroad, she served in Delhi, Calcutta, and then eventually China. Her weapon was black propaganda. Black propaganda goes to point of origin. A newspaper is faked to look like it was printed in Honshu province in Japan, when really it came off a press in Delhi. Radio stations pretended to be Radio Tokyo or something similar when they were actually being transmitted from a hand crank generator in Chittagong. So I always explain black propaganda by saying Tokyo Rose did not practice black propaganda because she really was in Tokyo. So again, it was about the origin. This sort of psychological warfare, I believe the CIA now is calling it influence operations. Next. So part of what Betty did were these projects. So the Japanese then as now value aesthetic beauty in everyday things. And so Betty and her crew constructed these matchbooks with hand whittled and dipped matches inside to put a subversive message in them. So to do something like this is tedious. They had to have exactly the right paper, the right 3 vegetable dyes for the wood block, and next. And to do the insert, the kanji script had to be very exact, and the ink and paper as well, every little detail, because, you know, the Japanese weren't stupid and they could spot some sloppy kind of propaganda. Next. So this is a postcard. The title of my book, OSS Operation Black Mail, came from one of Betty's most successful endeavors. She hired a Burmese assassin and sent him out on a trail to kill a Japanese courier. These couriers roamed freely up and down the trails, taking mail to the units and, you know, then bringing what they sent back. She killed this soldier, courier, and he brought Betty a fistful of postcards that young soldiers had written that were headed for the home islands. And she quickly realized that not only were they in pencil, but it was what she called farm boy Japanese. Very easy for her and her colleagues. They were all Japanese linguists to varying degrees. So they erased these loving messages home and replaced them with some truly fiendish things. I'll give you one example. A young soldier wrote to his wife at home, "Dear Keiko, the situation here has become unbearable. The war is lost. Do not believe what the government is telling you. I myself have fallen in love with a Kachin maiden and have been welcomed into her village where I will remain when my unit moves on. Please go on without me. Your loving husband, Yoki." So, wicked. If you notice the red up in the top left-hand corner, this was the key to this whole operation because that is the censor's chop. That means it had made it through all the gatekeepers and it was headed for Japan. So she had her assassin, this was an ongoing operation. So she had her assassin either go plant these back on the same courier or kill another one and plant them there. Next. Spring of 1945. Betty boarded a C-47 at Dum Dum Airport in Calcutta and flew the hump to Kunming, China. I'm sure you all have read about the hump and the high mortality rate. She looked out the window and could see the aluminum trail of death, all the planes that were below her in the snow. Kunming is an ancient city on top of a 7,000-foot plateau. The Japanese armies were surging all around the base of that plateau. So now she was behind enemy lines. Next. Here she is in China working on, it was a little different from when she was in India, because this was more like regular newspaper work. They had actual magazines and newspapers that went out on a regular basis. And so she got into that schedule, which reminded her a lot of what she did in Hawaii, writing fake stories and poems and things from soothsayers predicting all kinds of catastrophes if the Japanese didn't surrender. Here she is picking out some graphics with one of her Chinese helpers. She served in China until the war was over, and then OSS was disbanded October 1st, 1945, and she stayed on at the request of Donovan to write station history, which is, you can imagine, she was quite the writer. So it was really well done, and it's right there in the National Archives. Next. Here she is at 98 years old. She'd just gotten home from swimming, driving herself. She lived to be 100 years old. And on her 100th birthday, the CIA brought her in to have dinner on the 7th floor of headquarters, served her her favorite chocolate cake. And we lost her that same year. Next. So those of you who didn't know anything about OSS, I hope you enjoyed this. It's a fascinating organization, just so many layers. People like, well, one of the generals I can't think of said there was something almost mythical about OSS, and it's true. And when you read about the strange people, creatives, soldiers of fortune types that joined OSS because they really couldn't find a home in the regular military, you can just go down endless rabbit holes. Next. And if you haven't visited Prince William Forest Park, please give it a try. It's truly lovely. And that's all I got. Thank you. I know where you are, Melissa. I recognize that.
Well, thank you so much, both for the story of a fascinating life and also an understudied piece of World War II history. I'm sure many of our attendees have questions. If they do, I invite them to type them into the chat at any time. And near the end of our program today, we'll review them and ask a couple to be answered. But before then, I am going to introduce our next panelist and kind of set the stage for what he has to talk about. At the conclusion of the Second World War, Allied opinions differed on the appropriate punishment for surviving Axis leaders. At Yalta, Winston Churchill proposed summary execution, but the other members of the Big Three preferred public trials. For Stalin, these meant show trials that were didactic in nature to make an example of defendants and kind of document their crimes for all the world to see. But largely due to American influence, the Allies instead established international military tribunals that tried German and Japanese leaders individually using due process, granting defendants such benefits as the presumption of innocence until proven guilty, and the right to defend themselves against those charges brought against them. These trials in Nuremberg and Tokyo would result in hundreds of convictions, dozens of executions, and important precedents even today for international law. So though their significance can scarcely be questioned, their reception, even from contemporary audiences, was mixed. Some commentators decried the sentences for the guilty as insufficiently harsh. Others criticized the proceedings as less than legally scrupulous. Modern assessments are complicated even further by new knowledge of secret American intelligence operations that shielded many prospective defendants entirely from prosecution. So here to teach us more, we have Brian Crim, the Cohen Chair for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College in New Hampshire. Dr. Crim has made a profession of writing and teaching students about modern European history, especially the Second World War, the Holocaust and its legacy. He's kind enough to have some of his works up behind him on his screen. Among his publications are Anti-Semitism in the German Military Community and the Jewish Response, 1914 and 1938, Planet Auschwitz, Holocaust Representation in Science Fiction, Horror, Film, and Television. And I'm told that he recently was working on a book chapter that cited the oral history project of Jewish American interiors at Fort Hunt during World War II, which would be delightful to hear about some other time. But for today, very graciously, he's here to talk about Our Germans, Project Paperclip, and the national security state, and we are very lucky to have him. So I'm going to turn it over to him.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm hoping you can all see this in a slide format. Great. I'm always happy to do anything associated with the National Park Service. It's a wonderful opportunity, and thank you, Anne, for that really in-depth discussion into actually what's going on in Virginia. Unfortunately, I will not be able to get us into such detail into Virginia, although there is a Fort Hunt connection to my talk. I do want to talk about this, I think, pretty well-known concept of German scientists and technicians coming to the United States and participating in our defense industries and the space program. But the point of Our Germans was to really take away some of the mythology behind that story. For example, it either paints the United States as being incredibly guilty of cover-ups and doing all kind of nasty things, or it's overly supportive of the idea of bringing these Germans in without any critical analysis. I tried to strike an even balance. So the discussion, the title of my paper here is Our Germans Are Better Than Their Germans, How Project Paperclip Transformed the U.S. National Security State. The quote is from a joke by Bob Hope, the comedian, upon the news of Sputnik in October 1957. It really shocked the United States in particular. Lyndon Johnson called it a second Pearl Harbor. And Bob Hope had this great joke. He said, well, don't worry, our Germans are better than their Germans. And it was an acknowledgement that both the Soviet Union and the United States had a number of German scientists openly working on the space race for both either side. And it kind of also showed just how widespread this knowledge was, that we had so many former Nazis working in our highest levels of government. The Project Paperclip was an enormous project. It had 1,600 scientists and their families come over between 1945 and really the early 1950s. But most of what we know, and the most famous of those paperclip scientists, were the so-called rocket team led by Werner von Braun, pictured here before he came to the United States, working at the Peenemünde Army Research Institute in the Baltic coast. He's the only civilian you can see. And he was only in his early 20s in this picture. He was a wunderkind in every sense of the word, getting his PhD at age 20. And there at Peenemünde, he was responsible for building what is considered the first ICBM, a very early prototype. The V2 rocket, really it was called the A4, but Joseph Goebbels, a propaganda minister, named it after vengeance. The V2 rocket was supposed to be a game changer. For a lot of reasons, we'll see that it wasn't during the war, but certainly represented a giant leap forward in rocketry, especially with the idea of guided missiles as a concept. And in Peenemünde is where they built these before the Allies bombed the area, and they had to move underground to build them. This is also an overview of how they worked. What was unique really was that sort of second to the middle section there, the automated control, the guiding beam. That was what made it particularly lethal and interesting for the United States and the Soviet Union in particular, who wanted access to that technology, if not the people who made it. Well, let's talk about Project Paperclip. Even before the war was over, the Allies were interested in snatching this technology, if not the scientists. The British and the United States combined to create something called the T-forces, or technical forces. One of them there is the 30th Assault Unit, is a British T-force that included none other than Ian Fleming among its members, creator of James Bond. So he was part of this search for technology. The United States ran its version of its plan to acquire these scientists through a small subset of the Joint Chiefs of Staff called the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency. Really, its sole job was to hunt for scientists, bring them into a secure area, and eventually the idea of Paperclip came about bringing them to the United States. The initial program was called Overcast, and the name that name had leaked out, so they had to change it to Paperclip, which is how we know it now mostly. The reason they called it Paperclip is because Army ordnance officers would put a paperclip on the dossiers of scientists they were interested in, and that would tell any security investigator to not look too deeply, because they were notoriously very pro-Nazi. They were members of the Nazi Party. Many of them were in the SS. They had a lot of ugly history behind them. So in order to pass our own denazification laws, you put this paperclip on the dossier, and that basically said, let's let this one slide. 1,600 of those people slid. In the early 1950s, a version of Paperclip continued called Project 63, when we were literally stealing scientists from the West German government without them knowing about it for a couple more years. That led to a lot of diplomatic problems, as you might imagine. Paperclip, most of the people who came over, that 1,600, were employed by the Department of Defense, but also eventually a private industry. And a lot of great examples, and many became academics as well. What about the rocket team? V2 rockets cost a total of $3 billion for the Nazis and led to very little in return other than making the scientists themselves pretty valuable. It was considered by all military historians a strategic failure. It's also one of the few weapons, maybe the only weapon, where more people died building it than who actually died from its use. 20,000 slave laborers, Russian POWs, some Jews, but usually concentration camp victims from other categories, died building this, building the V2. and 2,500 British and Dutch civilians. And it was eventually an SS-controlled project, but it started as a Wehrmacht German army project. Let's talk about their Germans, a little bit about the Soviet version of Paperclip. They also, of course, were pretty successful in acquiring scientists, sometimes by bribery and sometimes by force. Their operation, Ozafikium, which was conducted in a few days in October of 1946, basically kidnapped several thousand German scientists and technicians and 19 trainloads of them and shipped them off to the east. And while they were treated pretty well, it's a different way of going about it than how the United States went about it. They got more experts, we got the better ones, is generally what people would say, including the Soviet Hall included nuclear experts, a lot of aeronautics experts, and just generally skilled labor that saved them a few dollars. But they did have a lot of success as well. I love this quote to kind of summarize how the scientists themselves viewed their situation. We despise the French. We are mortally afraid of the Soviets. We do not believe the British can afford us, and that was very true. So that leaves the Americans. And there's Wernher von Braun upon his quote unquote capture, even though he drove into the U.S. military lines and said, "Please take me." That was his capture. And we were the most better option, you could say. Some of the controversies around Paperclip that came out because of great investigative journalism and historians and release of new records included the fact that many of the scientists we brought over were involved in horrific concentration camp experimentation. Some of those scientists would become synonymous with aerospace medicine. Slave labor and executions were conducted on a regular basis, including by Arthur Rudolph, who was a senior NASA scientist, one of the fathers of the Saturn rocket program. He was forced to be returned to Germany to face trial, although he never did. But he was someone who lived quite comfortably in the United States for many years. Most of them, if not all of them, had SS and National Socialist affiliations, meaning they also joined pretty early in the party, which showed that they were true believers. And all this reflected, for the United States, deeply inadequate and non-existent denazification procedures. One of the most fascinating people I encountered in writing Hard Germans was a man named Walter Jessel, who was a German Jewish emigre from Frankfurt, and he was attached to the Third Army under Patton, and he was one of the first to interview the rocket team. And he left a diary that his family lent to me, as well as writing in the reports he wrote that are in the National Archives. Very honest, forthcoming, and one of the few very accurate reports about these scientists. One of the few who would cast doubt on them and what they're selling. So I love this quote in an actual intelligence report. The team consists of rocket enthusiasts and engineering college graduates, professors, all unrepentant Nazis, aware of their bargaining power with the Americans. He really knew who they were. That led me to understand where he came from. And a lot of you probably might be familiar with the Ritchie boys. He was among the 2,000 German and Austrian Jews who escaped, fled Nazi Germany, and enlisted in the U.S. Army, mostly in intelligence roles. Camp Ritchie is in Hagerstown, Maryland, and they trained these German Jews who had all these abilities to be interrogators, translators, and also war crimes investigators. Walter Jessel was one of those. That leads me to my Virginia connection, because so many of those Ritchie boys wound up at Fort Hunt, Virginia, with that code word of P.O. Box 1142, who were responsible for a number of things going on at the fort, starting in 1941, the German military documents section. All those captured documents had to go somewhere and be translated. Escape and Evasion, Strategic Interrogation Center, where many of these Ritchie boys would ply their trade. So there were a total of 3,000 POWs at Fort Hunt, including 55 German generals. It was a paperclip waypoint for all those paperclip scientists, not all of them, but a lot of them, including von Braun, spent some time at Fort Hunt. And this is where we learned a great deal about the wonder weapons. And their interrogators were German Jews and Austrian Jews. I want to highlight that by letting you know that you can read these interrogations and these transcripts, or at least not the interrogations, but the oral histories of the people who conducted those translations on the National Park Service website. Fort Hunt Oral History Project was very useful for my work. And what amazed me is that about 2/3 of the people who were interviewed in 2006, 2007 were German and Austrian Jewish refugees, and now, of course, American citizens. But a fascinating thing to look through if you are inclined. I'm going to run through this. What was the case for paperclip? That was, why, how was it beneficial? The military benefits included things we know about: the rocketry, guided missiles, the ICBM, help with advanced aeronautics, including expediting our use of jet engines, electronics, infrared, including the electric submarine was something you could add to that arsenal. Economic benefits were even more obvious, which is why Truman signed off on this controversial project. Eisenhower himself said, look, capturing these people are the only reparations we're likely to get. US companies also were sometimes ahead of the game. In one case, I read the Bulova Watch Company sent their own kind of T-force over there and snatched some scientists to see how they could make better watches without even telling the US military. And maybe that's why they're so expensive, right? But Henry Wolsey, Commerce Secretary, famous, kind of liberal politician, was someone who really believed in paperclip because he thought it was good for business. And it was for a while. But I wanted to also kind of highlight the opposition to paperclip, and there was a lot of it. And I spent a lot of time in my book writing about it. The State Department was horrified because we were essentially asking the other countries to turn over their Nazis who had fled and were in hiding and being rewarded by other governments, including in South America. But at the same time, we were letting in 1,600 people using visas that were meant to go to displaced persons and Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. That was something that many of them despised. The Department of Justice, including later the Office of Special Investigation, would go after people like Arthur Rudolph. The FBI initially was very against paperclip, but J. Edgar Hoover was convinced that it was good to fight communism to let them in. So then he went in the opposite direction and started to prosecute people who stood in the way of paperclip. Many members of Congress also stood up against it. Albert Einstein wrote a New York Times editorial calling the scientists the bacillus carriers of Nazism. Federation of American Scientists, Robert Oppenheimer, and Rabbi Stephen Weih, American rabbi and head of the World Jewish Congress, stood up against it, and the NAACP all took their stand. Just to kind of round out what happens with our most famous paperclip scientist, Wernher von Braun, we know will be sort of a legend. He's buried in Alexandria. It's another Virginia connection. He was first initially brought over to head up the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, at least the scientific portion, in Huntsville, Alabama. Then that was transferred to NASA and becomes the core of NASA when Eisenhower is leaving office. Well, yeah, and wanted that to be a civilian-controlled thing. So NASA is built around the ABMA. He becomes a legend. Wernher von Braun, close associated with Walt Disney, makes him a household name, and will be among the few celebrated German scientists. Most of them were referred to remain quiet. He becomes something other than just a former German scientist. He becomes an American hero. And here he is with John F. Kennedy a week before the assassination, explaining the Saturn system, which was, of course, going to be crucial in the space race. The legacy, just to end with some of the things that I bring up in my book, it gets in, obviously, the politics of science and scientists. What is the role of the scientist in a regime like the Third Reich? Are they truly apolitical? The answer, of course, is no. There never has been, but it certainly gets us thinking as scholars, and also in our own time, the role of science in politics, and historically the role of science in the Third Reich. Many of these 1,600 people built our military-industrial complex, not just these rocket team members, but these other scientists wound up in Boeing and Dell Labs and everywhere, building our Cold War arsenal. And also the bitter fight between different offices is a key to my book. The dysfunctional Cold War bureaucracy is truly a part of the story. And I end with von Braun's sort of Faustian bargain. When he died in 1976, the Washington Examiner did did their story about him and noted he was Faustian because he would do anything and agree to work with anybody if it furthered his passion for space. And they also noted in this article that maybe it also says a lot about the United States and our Faustian bargain to work with the worst of the worst for short term and in some cases very limited gains in scientific advancement. But obviously I've said a lot and Anne said a lot, so I will leave the rest for our discussion. Thank you.
Truly fascinating. Thank you so much. Next, what we want to do is put aside at least a few minutes to give us an opportunity to ask questions. We'll give people some time to think over what Dr. Crim has shared with us. Why don't we first turn to a question for Ann Todd?
Hi. So we have a question for you. What drew you to research like the Office of Strategic Services? It had like a very short history, but it's fascinated a lot of people. Every time we talk about Prince William Forest Park's like long history, people are always drawn to the OSS and the Office of Strategic Services. So what initially drew you to research that, as opposed to like all the other avenues of historical research?
Well, I'll try to keep this brief. I always wanted to be a spy, and I learned Russian, and I worked on a first PhD researching women in combat during the Soviet period in Moscow. Got tired of that, walked away from it, and came back. And this time I wanted to do something about American spies during World War II. And I landed on this wonderful woman, just casting about for a dissertation topic. And yeah, I said to her, I met with her. I said, I'd like to write about you and make it into a book. And she goes, why would you want to do that? Now, Betty was a rock star in the intelligence community, but she didn't feel that way. So anyway, that led me to OSS. And like I said, you can just go forever with that topic.
For Brian Crim, I wonder to what extent the kind of strategy that the United States had with Germany after the war is something that can be extrapolated to a general blanket strategy for all the Axis powers after the war. Our viewers may be familiar with the story, for example, of Unit 731. For those who are not, very briefly, these were human experimentations and other things that the Japanese Empire conducted on Chinese. And the MacArthur apparatus after the war, my understanding is that it was in a way similar, right? That he was interested in some of the data and, exempted a lot of the Japanese scientists from prosecution and exchange. So was there kind of a centralized decision to take this posture? Do you know of any kind of Italian stories that are analogous?
Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, what's kind of fascinating is just how many times we are fighting each other and different offices believe different things. So you had at the same time, we will have this robust legal regime. We wanted to prosecute these crimes. You had whole other offices who were undermining most people because they wanted the data, they wanted the scientists themselves, and they knew that they were really playing games with each other, and as well as every ally For example, we look at this U.S.-Soviet rivalry, and in fact, what I found more of the problem for the United States was the French. The French were stealing more scientists than the Soviets were, and we're even having meetings with the Soviets going, we got to do something about these French people who are totally breaking all of our laws and stealing stuff. We got to stop them. So I was always fascinated by how this period of 45 to 47 is so rich, and contradicts, I think, a lot of what we tend to think is always was the case, that we were angry at the Soviets and this was heading toward a Cold War. But as far as well, the Italians didn't have much to offer, but I had a lot of people ask me, and I wrote about it in my book a bit, and I think there's another book in there somewhere for somebody, is why was there no Japanese paperclip? Because they had their own scientists that were quite talented, and in some cases there was. We did have a separate regime to investigate and take what knowledge they had, and even some of them wound up in Fort Hunt or in the Long Island equivalent that had it, but it was not nearly at the sustained level. And part of it was this cultural idea that, well, the Japanese can't fit into American culture the way these Germans could, and we can offer the German citizenship, but we can't offer the Japanese citizenship because it would be, Americans wouldn't accept that. But somehow we would accept Nazis living among us, and we did.
Thank you. And then we have a question, actually a two-part question in the chat for Anne. Was Area C in Prince William Forest Park training a parallel to the NSA training at the time?
The NSA, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. As far as I know, the NSA came about with the National Security Act of 1947. So when I say that OS gave birth to things like the NSA, the communications branch obviously kind of evolved with the CIA, and then I think the NSA, I really don't know. I should look this up. It may not have happened in 47 when the CIA did, but maybe a little later.
Second part of that question was, did Betty's black propaganda involve any spoofing of radio frequencies for the fake radio stations, or was it based on using local dialects?
Oh, most of it was imitating Japanese. A lot of it. So what they would do, they'd have their programs in Japanese, and they would, on the radio dial, they would snug them right up against, for example, Radio Tokyo. So when a soldier would be spinning the dial, he'd just run across that, and think he'd landed on Radio Tokyo. And the programs were usually better than what the Japanese were putting out, more music and whatnot. And OSS also had Operation Muzak, which was the equivalent for the Germans. Played lots of music and whatnot. And the Germans usually knew they were being snookered, but they didn't care because the music was so good. Marlene Dietrich, especially.
So for Brian Crim, take a couple minutes to kind of set this up. As far as you're talking about this period of time and what international relations are like, and how it's sometimes more complicated than conventional tellings of it may suggest. Sometimes today, part of what makes this period of history so interesting to people is that you see vestiges of it in, the international order today in a lot of ways. For example, and this is just a brief thing for setting up, I was speaking with a visitor from Germany, and she was sharing with me that, well, today she thinks, her hypothesis is that you can see very clearly kind of the differences in denazification that took place in East Germany and West Germany, right? And in particular, what she was referring to is that in East Germany, there was denazification, but it maybe emphasized the Holocaust less. And in her view, this was something that was visible regionally in different parts of Germany. So who knows about that hypothesis? But my question for you, by kind of analogy, is as part of your presentation with, the rivalry with USSR and their kind of version of paperclip being, a similar thing, but quite different. There was an American style and a Soviet style. Are there any kind of repercussions for that? Interesting kind of vestiges or that, or influences it might have that might surprise people, that might be visible later into the 20th century, even today?
Yeah, very very much so. It's a great question because I can get into the fact that a remarkable thing happened in the mid 1950s. The Soviets returned most of their German scientists because they didn't trust them, and Stalin himself, and Stalin was dead by then, but Stalin never gave the German scientists the same access or invent or trust that we gave ours, and so therefore they didn't have as strong of effect uh, on their development in a way that we could say, at least with the rocket team we did. So they kept the Germans in these little enclaves and tried to milk them from what they had, and then return them, which was unheard of for something we would. The security risk of that even was bizarre. The CIA, I remember spending a whole lot of time trying to track down those German scientists and say, "What did you see? What did you see? What were they building? What are they building?" And they could honestly say they didn't know because they weren't given much access. And that's just that approach was detrimental to the Soviets in the long run versus where we integrated the Germans not only in society because they lived freely as Americans eventually, but with giving them complete access to uh, every highest level of security event, and that was something a lot of Americans had a problem with, but it ultimately paid more dividends than the Soviet version.
Brian Crim, author of Our Germans, Project Paperclip and the National Security State, and Ann Todd, author of OSS Operation Black Mail, One Woman's Covert War Against the Imperial Japanese Army. Thank you both so much for your time.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Before we conclude, I just want to say a few words to offer special thanks to everybody else who made this possible, especially our co-hosts, Melissa Weih, Laura Odegaard, and all of our friends at Martha Washington Library, my boss, Scott Hill, all my coworkers, Miguel Roberson, Christopher Strada, Brett, Christian Lagunas, Rashida Jamal, John Underdahl Pierce, and Vince Handrahan. Most of all, though, anybody who tuned in, you, ladies and gentlemen, are the reason why we do this. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. So thanks so much for your interest. There is much more to do always. At Fort Hunt, I'm taking people on some history hikes where you can learn a little bit more about some of this in September. Melissa, I know, has some OSS programming that is scheduled for November. I'm going to leave an email address for me in the chat box, and if you write me about either one, Prince William Forest or Fort Hunt, I'll be sure to get you any information you might want to have. But until then, just thank you. God bless you. May God bless this country. All of us are fortunate enough to call our home. Take care.